Greetings, travelers, adventurers, and seekers of wisdom. Welcome to our channel, where we embark on journeys through ancient tales, forgotten legends, and timeless lessons. Today, we gather around the hearth to listen to the words of an old sage, a man whose wisdom flows like a river that has traversed centuries of experience. His name is Thaddeus, a figure who carries the weight of countless stories and who has learned much in his long life. But before we dive into today's tale, remember to hit that subscribe button and join our growing community of truth seekers. By subscribing, you'll be the first to hear the latest stories, life lessons, and thought-provoking tales from around the world. Now, let us walk into the realm of old Thaddeus, whose insights remind us not to fear mistakes, but to see them as paths to wisdom. Thaddeus sat in his carved wooden chair, its time-worn creaks a gentle reminder of the years he had seen pass. His hair, silver as the moonlight, hung in long, unruly strands, and his hands, wrinkled, weathered, but still strong, moved gracefully as he began to speak, weaving his words like an ancient tapestry. His eyes, though aged, retained a youthful glimmer, the spark of one who had lived many lives within a single lifetime. They reflected the depth of wisdom he had gained through years of trials, triumphs, and, most importantly, mistakes.
"Gather closer, my dear friends,"
he said, his voice steady and warm, yet filled with the authority that only experience could give.
"I see the worry in your faces. You have come to me, seeking guidance, perhaps burdened by the weight of mistakes you have made, or the fear of mistakes yet to come. But let me tell you, mistakes are nothing to fear. They are the very foundation upon which all true growth is built. I have lived long enough to know that no one, no hero, no king, no master, ever reached greatness without stumbling many times along the way."
The circle of listeners leaned in, drawn by the promise of the old sage's wisdom. Some were young and eager to learn, while others, older and more weathered, still sought the comfort that only experience could bring. Thaddeus took a deep breath and began to share his stories.
"Many years ago,"
Thaddeus began, his voice becoming softer, reflective.
"when I was but a young man just setting out into the world, I crossed paths with a warrior named Kieran. He was a man whose name inspired both awe and fear wherever he went. In battle, Kieran was unmatched. His skill with a sword was legendary, his movements swift as the wind, and his strength seemingly unyielding. He had never been defeated, not once, and he wore his undefeated record as a badge of honor. Wherever he walked, people spoke of him with reverence, whispering of his invincibility, his untouchable nature. And yet,
Thaddeus paused.
It was only when Kieran tasted defeat for the first time that he truly became a master of his craft."
The listeners grew quiet, hanging on every word. Thaddeus continued.
"Kieran's downfall came in the form of overconfidence, a common ailment of those who have known nothing but success. His village, a peaceful and prosperous place, was suddenly threatened by a marauding band of raiders, ruthless and cunning, led by a battle-hardened captain named Thorak. Thorak had spent years raiding, plundering, and leaving nothing but destruction in his wake. The villagers, terrified, turned to Kieran, their champion, to protect them. And Kieran, ever so confident in his abilities, accepted without hesitation. He boasted that the raiders would be nothing more than a fleeting nuisance. He would dispatch them easily, just as he had vanquished every other foe who had dared cross his path."
Thaddeus's voice lowered, drawing his listeners even closer.
"But pride, my friends, is a dangerous companion. It blinds us to the dangers that lie ahead." Kieran rode out to meet Thorak's forces without hesitation, his armor gleaming in the sunlight, his sword sharp and ready. He did not even consider scouting the terrain or devising a strategy. He was Kieran, the undefeated. What need did he have for such precautions? And so, with his warriors behind him, he charged headlong into the battle.
The old man paused, letting the tension build.
But the battlefield was treacherous. Thick fog clung to the ground, obscuring the landscape, and Kieran, in his haste, failed to notice the hidden ravine that lay ahead. His focus was only on Thorak, who stood on the other side, grinning, as if he knew exactly what was about to happen. With a single misstep, Kieran found himself tumbling into the ravine. His horse stumbled, and Kieran was thrown from the saddle, his body crashing hard against the rocks below. His sword, the very weapon that had never failed him, slipped from his grasp and clattered out of reach.
Thaddeus sighed, as though reliving the moment himself.
For 3 long days, Kieran lay at the bottom of that ravine, his body battered and broken, his pride shattered even more. He was alone, injured and helpless, far from the battle that he had so confidently entered. At first, his mind was consumed with anger and shame. How could this have happened to him, Kieran the undefeated? How could he have been so foolish, so careless? But as the hours turned to days, something within him began to change. Lying there in the silence, with nothing but the sound of the wind whispering through the ravine, Kieran had time to reflect on the mistakes that had led him there.
The firelight flickered across Thaddeus's face as he spoke, his words heavy with meaning.
It was in those 3 days, alone with his thoughts, that Kieran came to understand the true nature of mastery. He realized that his overconfidence had been his greatest enemy, not Thorak. He had relied too much on his past victories, believing that his strength and skill alone would carry him through any challenge. But strength and skill, while important, are not enough. It was humility that he had been missing, the humility to recognize that every battle is different, every foe unique, and that no matter how skilled a person may be, there is always more to learn.
Thaddeus smiled softly.
When Kieran was finally found by a wandering shepherd, weak but alive, he returned to his village not as the defeated warrior he had feared, but as a man reborn. He did not return to fanfare or celebration, for his victory had not come on the battlefield. His victory had been within himself, in the lessons he had learned from his fall. And from that moment on, Kieran was a different kind of warrior. He approached each battle with patience, with strategy, and with a deep respect for the unknown. He learned to plan, to observe, and to think before he acted. He no longer saw mistakes as something to fear or avoid, but as teachers, guides that helped him grow stronger and wiser.
Thaddeus's voice grew quiet as he finished.
And that, my dear friends, is how Kieran became not just a warrior, but a true master. He embraced his mistakes and allowed them to make him better.
Thaddeus took a long breath before continuing, his eyes gleaming as he prepared to tell his next story.
Now, let me share with you the story of the stonecutter, a man whose persistence and understanding of failure transformed not just his life, but the very nature of his craft. In a small village nestled in the mountains, there lived a humble stonecutter named Jorin. His work was laborious and often thankless. Day after day, Jorin would stand before the massive rocks, hammer and chisel in hand, chipping away at the stone. It was slow, grueling work. More often than not, the stone would fracture in the wrong places, ruining days or even weeks of effort. For years, Jorin toiled like this, growing more and more frustrated with each failed attempt. The villagers admired his perseverance, but Jorin, deep down, felt nothing but discouragement. He often wondered if he would ever master his craft, or if he was simply doomed to fail over and over again.
Thaddeus's voice grew contemplative.
One day, after yet another stone shattered in his hands, Jorin sat down by the river that flowed near his village, his heart heavy with despair. He watched the water flow over the stones in the riverbed, smoothing them over time. As he sat there, lost in thought, he realized something profound. The stones in the river had not always been smooth and perfect. They had started as rough, jagged rocks, much like the ones he worked with. But over time, the constant flow of the water had worn them down slowly, patiently, until they became the smooth stones he now saw before him.
The listeners leaned in closer, sensing the turning point in the story.
It was in that moment that Jorin understood a great truth. Mastery is not about perfection. It is about persistence. The river had not created the smooth stones in a single day, nor even in a year. It had taken years, perhaps centuries, of water flowing over the rocks, shaping them, smoothing them. And so it was with his craft. Each mistake he made was not a failure, but part of the process. Each fracture in the stone was a lesson, showing him what not to do, teaching him how to approach the stone differently next time.
Thaddeus smiled warmly, as though he could see the light of understanding dawning in his listener's eyes.
Jorin returned to his work with renewed energy and patience. He no longer cursed the stones when they fractured in the wrong place. Instead, he examined them closely, learning from each break. Over time, his skill grew, not because he stopped making mistakes, but because he learned from them. Years passed, and Jorin became known far and wide as one of the finest stonecutters in the land. His sculptures adorned temples and palaces, but when people asked him how he had become so skilled, he would always reply, by breaking many stones along the way.
Thaddeus chuckled softly, his voice taking on a more personal tone.
Even I, an old man who sits before you now, have made more mistakes than I can count. When I was younger, I worked as a carpenter. I took great pride in my craft, believing that I could build anything with my hands. But one day, I was given a commission to build a grand table for the village chief, a table that was to be the centerpiece of his great hall. I worked day and night, pouring all my energy and skill into the project. But in my haste to impress the chief, I made a crucial mistake. I cut the wood too thin. I wanted the table to be elegant and sleek, but in doing so, I weakened its foundation.
He paused, shaking his head at the memory.
When I assembled the table and placed it before the chief, it collapsed almost immediately, the wood splintering under its own weight. I was devastated. I had failed, and in front of the entire village, no less. I thought my reputation was ruined, that I would never be trusted with such an important task again. But the chief, a wise man, simply smiled and said, "It is only through the cracks in our work that light can shine through."
Thaddeus leaned back in his chair, his eyes twinkling.
I spent the next several weeks rebuilding that table, this time taking my time, ensuring that each piece of wood was strong enough to support the weight. I made mistakes along the way, but each one taught me something new. And when I finally presented the table to the chief, it was stronger, more beautiful, and more elegant than the original. That table still stands in his hall today, a reminder not of my failure, but of the lessons I learned from it.
As Thaddeus concluded his stories, the flickering light of the fire illuminated the faces of his listeners, who now looked not with worry, but with a sense of understanding. Thaddeus smiled warmly at his audience, his voice soft yet steady.
So, my dear friends, the next time you find yourself afraid of making a mistake, remember the tales I've shared with you today. Kieran, the stonecutter, and even I, all of us have grown not despite our mistakes, but because of them. It is through failure that we discover our true potential. Each error is an opportunity to learn, to adjust, and to grow. So go forth, make mistakes, embrace them, and let them guide you toward becoming the best version of yourself. And remember, you're never alone in your journey. Every master, every hero, and every sage you admire has stood where you are now, having learned through the trials of failure. If you've enjoyed these stories, please subscribe to the channel and join our community. Together, we'll continue exploring the wisdom of the ages, one tale at a time. Thank you for listening, and may your path be filled with lessons and light.
With those final words, Thaddeus leaned back in his chair, the fire's warmth wrapping around him like the lessons of a life well lived.